She lost everything in 9 minutes. Her badge, her office, her name dragged through every screen in the building while security walked her out like a criminal. What nobody knew was that the quiet woman crying in that elevator was married to the most dangerous man in Seoul, and he was already watching the footage, already making a list, already deciding who was going to pay for touching what belonged to him. Have you ever been punished for a crime you didn't commit while the one person who could destroy your enemies had no idea you were suffering? Stay until the end, because this story is about to show you what happens when a quiet man finally stops being quiet. Drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching from. Hit subscribe before the story starts, because trust me, you don't want to miss the moment he finds out. Let's begin. Zee Adeyemi had learned a long time ago that surviving in Seoul meant making yourself small. Small enough to be overlooked, small enough to be underestimated. Small enough that nobody asked too many questions about the Nigerian woman who'd climbed her way into the finance department of Beck Group in under 3 years. She kept her head down. She worked harder than anyone else in the building. She smiled at people who didn't deserve it and said nothing when junior staff got promoted over her for reasons that had nothing to do with merit. She had a secret that made all of it bearable. Nobody in that building knew her husband's name. Baek Do-hyun did not advertise his marriage. He didn't advertise much of anything. To the public, he was the reclusive chairman of a shipping and logistics empire that quietly controlled half the ports on the western coast. To the people who mattered, the ones who moved in rooms with no cameras, he was something else entirely. A man whose name made grown men reconsider decisions. A man who had inherited an organization his father built from nothing and turned it into something that didn't need to raise its voice to be obeyed. He had married Zee 18 months ago in a ceremony with 4 witnesses and no photographs, and he had asked her, on their wedding night, to keep it hidden. "Not because I'm ashamed of you," he'd said, his hand cupping her face like she was something that could shatter. "Because the moment my enemies know you exist, you become a target. I need time to make you untouchable first." She'd agreed. She hadn't expected it to mean going to work every single day as Zee Adeyemi, financial analyst, invisible woman, while her husband ran an empire she wasn't allowed to acknowledge even existed. She hadn't expected the loneliness of it, the way she sat in meetings and heard people mock foreign hires, heard them whisper about her accent, and had to swallow every word because outing herself meant outing him. It was a Tuesday morning when her world came apart. She arrived at 7:15 like always, badge in hand, coffee in the other, and found 2 men from corporate security waiting by her desk instead of her co-workers. Her supervisor, a thin nervous man named Jang Ho-suk, wouldn't meet her eyes. "Miss Adeyemi," one of the security officers said. "We need you to come with us." "Why?" The word came out steadier than she felt. "There's been a data breach. Confidential merger documents were leaked to a competitor 3 days ago. The internal trace points to your credentials." The room tilted. Zuri had never touched those documents. She didn't have clearance for the merger file, had never even heard of it until this exact moment, but the security officer was already turning his tablet toward her, showing a log with her employee ID stamped across a file transfer at 11:40 at night, a time she'd been at home, asleep, beside a husband who thought she was too tired to notice him watching her before he left for a call. "That's not me," she said. "I wasn't even in the building at 11 at night. The system says otherwise." By 9 that morning, she'd been escorted through the lobby in full view of 40 co-workers, her badge confiscated, a box of her belongings carried by a stranger because her hands were shaking too hard to hold it herself. Someone had already leaked it to the internal messaging boards. Foreign hire court selling company secrets. By noon it had a name attached that wasn't even accurate, and by 2, a junior reporter from a business gossip site had picked it up because Beck Group's name attracted clicks no matter what the story actually was. Zuri sat in her car in the parking garage for 40 minutes before she could make herself drive. She didn't call Do-hyun. She told herself it was because she didn't want to bother him during work hours. The truth, the uglier truth, was that some small terrified part of her wondered if this was the moment he'd decide she was more trouble than she was worth. Do-hyun found out at 2:47 in the afternoon, not from her, but from his head of intelligence, a quiet unreadable man named Choi Jae-sung who had a standing order to flag any mention of Zoe's name in any database in the country. Jae-sung didn't knock. He walked straight into Do-hyun's office, set a tablet on the desk without a word, and stepped back. Hune read the headline once. Then again. His face didn't move, which was the most dangerous thing about him. The stillness that settled over him right before something in the world was about to break. "When did this happen?" he said. Not a question. A demand. "This morning." She was walked out at 9:15. "And you're telling me now?" "I confirmed the trace was fabricated first. I wasn't going to bring you a fire without knowing where to point the hose." Hune stood. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice, and that was worse, because everyone in his organization had learned that the quieter Beck Hune got, the more likely someone was about to lose everything they had. "Get me the security footage from her building. Get me the login trace. Get me the name of whoever pulled her employee ID, and get me a list of everyone who had access to that merger file." He picked up his coat. "And get my car." If you love watching a controlled man become uncontrollable when someone he loves gets hurt, comment the word fire below, because that's exactly what's coming. Z didn't go home. She couldn't sit in that apartment, in the quiet, and think about explaining this to Hune, who had promised her that marrying him would make her untouchable, and instead she'd been made a public spectacle in under 4 hours. She drove to a small cafe near Hongdae that she used to visit before the wedding, back when she still had a version of a life that belonged only to her, and she sat by the window with tea she didn't drink and a phone she'd turned face down on the table. It buzzed anyway. 12 missed calls from a contact saved simply as him. She stared at it for a long moment before finally answering. "Where are you?" His voice was low, controlled, and underneath it, something that vibrated like a plucked wire. "I don't want you to see me like this." "Z." Just her name. It landed heavier than any command could have. "Where are you?" She told him. 20 minutes later, his car pulled up outside the cafe, black and unmarked the way he preferred, and he walked in wearing the suit he'd had on since 7 that morning, tie slightly loosened, jaw tight enough that the barista actually took a step back from the counter. He didn't say anything when he sat across from her. He just reached across the small table and took both her hands in his, and the gesture, so simple, so unlike the composed CEO the world thought it knew, made her throat close up. "I didn't do it," she said, before he could ask. "I know. You know. I've known since 2:47 this afternoon, when I saw the login trace that put you in the building at a time you were home, asleep, next to me." His thumb moved over her knuckles. "Someone fabricated evidence and used your credentials to move a file they wanted moved. This was never about you leaking anything. This was about hurting me through you." Zuri felt something crack open in her chest, something between relief and fury. "You believe me. Just like that. I would believe you over 100 security logs." His eyes, dark and unreadable to everyone but her, softened by a degree most people never got to see. "I'm sorry I wasn't there this morning. I'm sorry you sat in that garage alone. That is the last time that happens. Do you understand me?" "Hune, you can't just." "I can," he said, and there was nothing soft about it now. "I built an empire specifically so that no one could ever put their hands on the people I love without answering for it. Someone forgot that today. I am going to remind them." That evening, Zuri finally told him the part she'd been too proud to say. That she'd spent 3 years at Beck Group being underestimated, that she'd never used his name once even when it would have made her life easier, that she'd wanted, desperately, to prove she could be someone on her own before she ever let herself be known as his wife. He listened without interrupting, his hand never leaving hers, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You built something for yourself in a building I own and never once used my name to make it easier," he said slowly. "Do you know how rare that is? Everyone in my life wants something from me. You spent 3 years hiding the one thing that would have made your life easy. I wanted it to be mine. It is yours." He lifted her hand, pressed his lips to her knuckles, brief and reverent. "And I'm going to make sure the people who tried to take it from you understand exactly what that costs." The next morning, Choi Jae-sung had a name. Her name was Han Se-yeon, Deputy Director of Corporate Strategy, a woman who had joined Beck Group 8 months before Zuri and who had, according to 3 separate sources Jae-sung had quietly turned over the last 12 hours, been pursuing a merger with a rival conglomerate on the side, feeding them information in exchange for a position on their board once the deal she was sabotaging collapsed. Framing Zee had been a convenient twofer. It removed a witness who'd stumbled across an irregularity in a budget report 2 weeks earlier, and it created enough chaos in the finance department that nobody would think to look closely at who actually benefited from the leak. There was a second name attached, one that made Do-Hyun's jaw go tight when Jae-sung said it out loud. Lim Tae-wook, a rival businessman Do-Hyun had outmaneuvered twice in the last 2 years, a man who had never forgiven the humiliation and who, it turned out, had been quietly financing Han Se-yeon's ambitions in exchange for information that would let him undercut Beck Group's merger before it closed. He's not just after the deal, Jae-sung said. He found out about the marriage 3 months ago. He's been sitting on it, waiting for the right moment to use it. Do-Hyun's expression didn't change, but the air in the room did. How long has he known? Long enough to plan this. Then he already knows framing her wasn't going to break me. Do-Hyun stood, walked to the window, looked out over the city that had no idea how close it had just come to watching a war start over one woman's stolen reputation. He wanted to see what I would do. Let's show him. If you think this is where it gets dangerous, you're right, and if you want to see exactly how far a man like this will go to protect his wife, make sure you're subscribed, because it only escalates from here. By Thursday, Zeri's name had been quietly scrubbed from every gossip board that had run the story, not through denial, but through a much more effective method. Beck Group's legal team released a statement confirming that an internal investigation had identified the actual source of the breach and that appropriate action was being taken, without naming Zee at all, effectively letting the story die of starvation. Reporters who tried to dig further found their editors suddenly uninterested. 2 of them received calls from numbers they didn't recognize, polite, calm voices suggesting the story wasn't worth pursuing further, and somehow that was enough. But scrubbing the internet wasn't enough for Do-Hyun, and Zee knew it the moment she saw him leave the penthouse Thursday evening in a black coat instead of his usual suit, the coat he only wore when he intended to be somewhere he didn't want cameras. "Where are you going?" she asked, standing in the doorway of their bedroom. "To have a conversation." "With who?" He paused at the door, looked back at her, and for a moment the mask slipped, just enough that she saw the fury underneath, banked and controlled but very much alive. "With the man who thought putting your name in a headline was an acceptable way to reach me." Do-Hyun. She crossed the room fast, caught his sleeve. "Don't do something you can't undo." "I'm not going to touch him." His voice gentled, just for her. "I'm simply going to make sure he understands the difference between a business rival and a man whose wife he threatened. Those are very different conversations, Zeri, and he's been having the wrong one." He kissed her forehead, brief, deliberate, and left before she could argue further. The meeting happened in a private room at a restaurant in Gangnam that Lim Tae-wook favored, the kind of place with low lighting and staff who knew how to disappear. Do-Hyun arrived without security, which unsettled Tae-wook more than an army would have, because a man who walked into a room alone was a man who wasn't worried about what might happen in it. Do-Hyun. Tae-wook's smile was thin. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" Do-Hyun sat without being invited. "You spent 3 months sitting on information about my wife and then decided the right way to use it was to destroy her career and put her name in every business gossip column in the city." Tae-wook's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "I don't know what you're referring to." "Han Se-yeon has already given a full statement to my legal team." It wasn't entirely true yet, but it would be within the hour, and Do-Hyun said it with enough certainty that Tae-wook's composure cracked half a degree. "She's named you as the source of funding for her position at your firm in exchange for the merger sabotage. She's also named you as the one who suggested framing my wife specifically, because you knew exactly what it would cost me to watch her suffer publicly while I couldn't say a word about why it mattered so much. If this is a negotiation..." "It isn't." Do-Hyun leaned forward, and his voice dropped to something quiet enough that Tae-wook had to lean in to hear it, which was exactly the point. "I built my life making sure nothing I love is vulnerable. You found the one gap. I'm here to tell you that gap is closed now, permanently, And if you or anyone connected to you comes near my wife again, in any capacity, public or private, I will not be having a polite conversation over dinner. Do you understand me? Taewook's jaw worked. You're threatening me in a public restaurant. I'm informing you. Hune stood, buttoned his coat. The merger you were trying to sabotage closes Friday. Your firm's credit lines with 3 separate banks are going to become significantly less generous by end of week, not because I asked them to be, but because your involvement in a corporate espionage scandal is about to become impossible to hide. That part isn't a threat. That part is simply what happens to men who touch things that don't belong to them. He left without waiting for a response, and Taewook sat alone in the private room for a long time before he picked up his phone. Later that night, Zuri woke to find the other side of the bed empty and Hune standing at the window of their bedroom. Still in his shirt from earlier, tie discarded somewhere, staring out at the city like he was trying to memorize the shape of every threat still hiding in it. You're not sleeping, she said softly, sitting up. I keep thinking about this morning. About you sitting in that garage alone for 40 minutes because you were afraid to call me. He turned to face her, and the exhaustion on his face wasn't from the hour. It was older than that. I promised you that marrying me would make you safer. Instead I spent 18 months hiding you so well that when something finally went wrong, you didn't even think to call your own husband. That's not fair to yourself. It's exactly fair. He crossed the room, sat on the edge of the bed, took her hand like it was something he needed to hold on to. I wanted to protect you from my world so badly that I built you a cage instead. A beautiful one. But a cage. You spent 3 years proving yourself in a building I own and I let you do it completely alone because I thought distance was the same as safety. Zuri reached up, touched his jaw, felt the tension there finally start to loosen under her palm. I chose that, Hune. I wanted to build something that was mine. I know. And I am proud of you for it. But I am done letting pride, mine or yours, keep you standing alone in moments like today. His eyes met hers, steady and certain in a way that made her chest ache. I want the world to know you're mine. Not because I need to control the narrative. Because I am tired of watching you carry things by yourself that were never meant to be carried alone. What are you saying? I'm saying the hiding ends. Whatever comes next, whatever it costs, we face it together, in the open, as what we actually are. He lifted her hand to his lips. Husband and wife. If you've ever loved someone who tried to protect you by keeping you at arm's length, you already know how much that confession cost him. Comment below if you felt that line the way I did, because what happens next is the moment everything changes. The following morning, Han Se-yeon was escorted out of Beck Group's headquarters in handcuffs, and this time the story that hit the news carried her name, her face, the full weight of a corporate espionage scandal with documented evidence and a signed confession that named Lim Taewook as her financier. Zuri watched the coverage from the penthouse, coffee cooling in her hands, and felt something in her chest finally unknot. Before any of that, there was a night neither of them talked about often, tucked quietly between the scandal and the kidnapping, a night that taught Zuri something about her husband she hadn't fully understood until she saw it with her own eyes. It happened at a fundraising gala 2 weeks after she was reinstated, the first public event they attended together as a known married couple, and it was there that Z met a man named Oh Min-suk, a smooth-talking junior executive from a partner firm who clearly hadn't gotten the memo about whose wife he was flirting with. Mrs. Beck, he said, appearing at her elbow while Hune was pulled into a conversation across the room. I have to say, the stories about you don't do you justice. Which stories? Zuri asked, more amused than flattered. The ones about a woman brilliant enough to survive Beck Group's finance department on her own merit. No favors, no shortcuts. That's rare in this city. Most people ride on a name the moment they get the chance. His smile widened, confident, oblivious. Can I get you a drink? I'd love to hear more about how you did it. I'm fine, thank you. Come on, one drink. Your husband looks busy enough not to notice. He reached out, fingers brushing lightly against her forearm, casual and entirely too familiar. And that was the exact moment Hune appeared at her other side, having crossed the entire ballroom in what felt like under 10 seconds. Min-suk. Hune's voice was pleasant, easy, The kind of tone that made experienced men in that room go very still, because they knew exactly what it meant when Baek Do-hyun sounded that relaxed. "I don't believe you've been introduced properly. This is my wife." "Of course, Chairman, I was just complimenting her work ethic." "I heard." Do-hyun's hand settled at the small of Zoe's back, unhurried, deliberate, a claim made without a single raised word. "She earned every part of her career without my name attached to it, which I'm sure you understand makes her considerably more impressive than most people in this room, myself included. I'd be careful, though. Touching my wife's arm without invitation tends to shorten conversations rather significantly in my experience." Min-suk's face drained of color so fast Zoe nearly felt sorry for him. He mumbled an apology and disappeared into the crowd within seconds, and Zoe turned to look at her husband, one eyebrow raised. Was that necessary? Completely. Do-hyun didn't look remotely apologetic. His jaw was tight, his eyes still tracking Min-suk's retreat across the room like a man watching a threat leave his territory. "I don't care how many people in this city think it's acceptable to touch a married woman like that means nothing. It means something to me." "You're jealous," Zoe said, and something in her voice made it clear she found this far more endearing than he probably intended. "I am protective," he corrected, though the faint color rising along his jaw suggested he knew exactly how thin that distinction actually was. "There's a difference." "Is there?" He looked at her for a long moment, and finally, reluctantly, the corner of his mouth curved. "Perhaps not much of one. I've spent 14 years not caring who looked at what belonged to me, because nothing mattered enough to provoke the feeling. You are the first thing that has ever made me want to put my fist through a wall over a hand on a forearm." His voice dropped, quieter, more honest. "I don't entirely know what to do with that." "You could start," Zoe said, stepping closer, resting her palm against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her hand, "by trusting that I chose you. Every day. Jealousy isn't necessary. Do-hyun. I'm not going anywhere." "I know." He covered her hand with his own, pressed it flatter against his chest, like he wanted her to feel exactly how much that admission cost a man who had spent his whole life guarding against needing anyone. "That doesn't make the feeling disappear. It just makes it easier to carry." They didn't speak of Min-suk again after that night, though Zoe noticed, with private amusement, that he never once appeared at another Baek group function for the rest of the year, having apparently found urgent business elsewhere every time an invitation arrived. She never asked whether that was coincidence or design. Some questions, she'd learned, were better left where her husband's particular brand of quiet influence could operate undisturbed. It was this same possessiveness, tender in its intent even when sharp in its execution, that made the kidnapping 2 weeks later cut so deep. A man who had learned, in the space of one gala, exactly how much he feared losing her to something as small as another man's forwardness was never going to survive 4 hours of not knowing if she was alive without it changing something fundamental in him. Zoe understood that now, looking back. The war he waged that night hadn't only been about vengeance. It had been about a man discovering, all at once and without warning, the true size of what he stood to lose. By the following morning, Baek Group's PR team released a second statement, this one carefully worded but unmistakable in its meaning. It confirmed that Zoe Adeyemi had been fully cleared of any wrongdoing, that the company deeply regretted the error, and that she had been reinstated to her position with full back pay and a formal apology from senior leadership. Buried in the third paragraph, almost as an afterthought that wasn't an afterthought at all, was a single line. Miss Adeyemi is also confirmed to be the wife of Chairman Baek Do-hyun. The internal messaging boards exploded within the hour. Every person who had whispered about the foreign hire, every junior staffer who had smirked when she was walked out in handcuffs, every one of them now had to reconcile the woman they'd dismissed with the reality of who she actually was. Z didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply walked back into the building Monday morning, badge reissued, and let the silence that fell over the lobby speak for itself. Jang Ho-suk, her supervisor, met her at her desk with an expression somewhere between terror and desperate apology. "Miss Adeyemi, I want you to know I never believed." "You didn't say a word in my defense," Zoe said, not unkindly, just honestly. "Not one. I remember." He had no answer for that, and she let him sit with it, because some lessons only stuck when you weren't handed a way out of them. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks passed in something close to peace. Zeri settled back into her role, no longer invisible, no longer hiding, and something had shifted in how she moved through her days, a woman who no longer had to make herself small to survive. Hune started walking her into the building some mornings, a small act that would have seemed unremarkable for any other couple but sent a ripple through the entire company each time, because Hune did not do public displays of anything, and the fact that he did this, consistently, deliberately, told everyone exactly what she meant to him. But Lim Tai-wook had not disappeared quietly. Men like him rarely did. He'd lost the merger, lost significant credit access, lost the position he'd promised Han Se-yeon that had cost him everything to arrange, and a man that humiliated didn't retreat, he escalated. It started small. A car that seemed to linger too long outside Z's building in the mornings. A courier delivery she hadn't ordered, containing nothing but a blank card. Hune's security team flagged the pattern within days and doubled her protection detail without telling her at first, which she discovered only when she noticed the same black SUV parked across from the cafe she liked to visit on her lunch break 3 days in a row. "You've had people watching me," she said that evening, more curious than upset. "Since Tuesday," Hune admitted. "Jae-sung flagged surveillance near your building. I didn't want to worry you until we understood the scope of it." Tai-wook. "We believe so. We haven't confirmed a direct connection yet, but the pattern matches how he's operated before. He likes to circle before he strikes." Hune's expression had gone carefully flat, the way it did when he was suppressing something larger. "I'm not going to let what happened before happen again. You are not going anywhere without protection until this is resolved." "I have a job, Hune. I can't have bodyguards following me into board meetings. Then we make it look like something else." A faint, humorless smile. "I have people who are very good at looking like they belong in a room." She wanted to argue on principle, but the memory of that morning in the parking garage, the box of her belongings, the whispers following her through the lobby, was still too fresh to let pride win. She agreed, reluctantly, and told herself it was temporary. It was not temporary. 3 days later, the situation became something far more serious. Zeri had stayed late at the office finishing a quarterly report, later than she'd intended, the building emptying out around her until it was mostly cleaning staff and the hum of fluorescent lights. Her protection detail, a quiet efficient woman named Song Harun who'd been introduced to her as a new hire in compliance, waited by the elevator bank at a respectful distance, close enough to intervene, far enough to let Z work without feeling watched. The elevator doors opened onto the parking garage and everything happened very fast. 2 men in dark clothing stepped out from behind a support column, and before Harun could react, one of them had a hand clamped over Zay's mouth while the other pressed something hard and cold against her ribs. "Don't scream," the first man said quietly, in accented Korean that suggested he wasn't from Seoul originally. "We're not here to hurt you. We just need you to come with us." Harun moved fast, faster than her quiet compliance officer cover suggested she should be able to, but there were 3 of them, not 2, and the third came out from behind a parked car and caught her from behind before she could reach for the weapon concealed at her hip. It was over in under a minute. Zai, gagged and disoriented, was pushed into the back of a van that peeled out of the garage before Harun, bleeding from a cut above her eye, could even get her phone out to make the call that would end up changing the trajectory of Hune's entire life. Hune was in a meeting when Jae-sung burst through the door without knocking for the second time in a month, and the moment he saw his face, Hune already knew, before a single word was said, that something had happened to Zeri. "She's gone," Jae-sung said. "Taken from the parking garage 12 minutes ago. Harun is injured but stable." 3 men, professional, coordinated. This wasn't opportunistic. The room went very still. Hune stood up slowly from the table, and every executive present would later describe the moment differently, but all of them agreed on one thing: the man who left that boardroom was not the same man who had walked in. Something in him had gone cold and absolute, the calculating stillness of someone who had just decided that every rule he'd ever followed no longer applied. "Get me Tai-wook's location," Hune said, voice flat as stone. "Get me every camera within a 2-mile radius of that garage. Get me Choi Beamjun and every man we have on standby. We move in 20 minutes. If someone you loved was taken from you in 12 minutes, how far would you go to get them back? Comment your answer, because what Hune does next is going to redefine what that word even means. Zuri woke in a room with no windows, wrists bound loosely enough that she could still feel her hands but tight enough that fighting the rope only tightened it further. Her head throbbed from wherever they'd hit her to keep her quiet during transport. The room smelled like motor oil and old concrete, some kind of warehouse or storage facility, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging from a wire overhead. The door opened. A man she didn't recognize stepped in, followed by Lim Taiwook himself, and the sight of him confirmed what she'd already suspected the moment she'd been thrown into that van. Mrs. Beck, Taiwook said, and the way he said her married name, like it tasted bitter in his mouth, told her everything about how personal this had become. I apologize for the accommodations. This wasn't how I wanted our first real conversation to go. My husband is going to find you, Zari said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, steadier than she felt. I'm counting on it. Taiwook pulled a chair over, sat facing her, close enough that she could smell expensive cologne under the warehouse dust. That's rather the point. Hune has spent his entire career making sure nothing he cares about is ever vulnerable. He built walls, hired the best security in the country, kept you hidden for 18 months so no one would even know you existed. And then he got careless. He let the world know exactly what you mean to him, and now I have you, and he is going to do something he has never done in 14 years of running that organization. What's that? He's going to panic. Taiwook smiled, thin and satisfied. A man who panics makes mistakes. I intend to be very well positioned when he makes his. Zuri held his gaze, refusing to let the fear show, though it was climbing up her throat with every second that passed. You think taking me gives you leverage? It doesn't. It gives him a reason to burn your entire life down and not lose a single night of sleep over it. Something flickered in Taiwook's expression, brief and unwilling, an acknowledgement that she wasn't entirely wrong. He stood, smoothed his jacket. We'll see how philosophical you feel in a few hours. In the meantime, make yourself comfortable. This may take a while. He left, and the door locked with a heavy metallic sound that echoed in the small concrete room. Zari sat alone in the single beam of light and did the only thing she could think to do, which was breathe, count the seconds, and trust, with a certainty that surprised her, that her husband was already coming. She was right. Hune's intelligence network had been assembled over 14 years for exactly this kind of moment, and within 90 minutes, Choi Jae-sung had traced the van's route through 3 separate traffic camera feeds to a warehouse district near the port that Beck Group's shipping operations knew intimately, because it sat on the edge of territory Hune's organization had controlled for over a decade. He picked a location on our own turf, Hune said, staring at the satellite map spread across the table in the war room beneath his headquarters, a space few people even knew existed. Either he's arrogant or he's desperate. Possibly both. Or he wants to be found, Choi Beamjun said, arms crossed, the scar along his jaw catching the low light. Men like Taiwook don't do subtlety. He wants a confrontation. He wants to prove something. Then we give him one. Hune's finger traced the warehouse's location on the map. But on my terms, not his. I want eyes on every exit before we move. I want to know how many men he has, what they're carrying, and I want a clean line to wherever they're holding her before anyone breathes near that building. It took another hour of careful, methodical planning, an hour that felt to Hune like it lasted a lifetime. Every minute another minute Zeri spent alone with a man who had already proven he was willing to hurt her to reach him. But he did not let the fear override the discipline that had kept him alive and in control for 14 years. Reckless men got the people they loved killed. He had not survived this long by being reckless, and he was not going to start now, not when the stakes had never been higher. By the time they moved, it was past midnight, and Hune's team surrounded the warehouse from 4 directions in complete silence, the kind of coordinated precision that came from years of preparing for exactly this scenario even while praying it would never be necessary. Inside, Zeri had lost track of how much time had passed when the door opened again. This time revealing not Taiwook but one of his men, agitated, speaking rapidly into a phone in a language she didn't recognize. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the tension radiating off him, in the way his eyes kept darting toward the door. Then the lights went out. Complete darkness, followed almost immediately by shouting, the sound of a struggle somewhere beyond the concrete walls, and Zeri pressed herself back against the wall, heart hammering, trying to make herself as small a target as possible while chaos erupted around her. A gunshot cracked through the darkness, sharp and close enough to make her flinch, followed by silence, then more footsteps, fast and controlled, moving toward her room. The door burst open. A flashlight beam swept the room and landed on her, and for one terrifying second she didn't know whose men had found her first. Then a voice, low and achingly familiar, cut through the dark. "Z. Hune." His name broke out of her on something between a sob and a gasp of relief, and then he was there, kneeling in front of her, hands working fast and careful at the ropes binding her wrists, his own hands not quite steady despite every effort at control. "I'm here. I'm here, you're safe now." He pulled her against his chest the moment her hands were free, one arm wrapped around her, the other cradling the back of her head like she might disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough. "I have you. I'm never letting you out of my sight again. Do you understand me?" She was shaking, adrenaline and fear finally catching up now that the danger had passed, and she buried her face against his shoulder and let herself, for just a moment, fall completely apart in the arms of the one person who had never once let her down when it mattered. "Taiwook," she managed. "He's here, he. Beam Jun has him." Do-Hyun's voice had gone hard again, the softness reserved entirely for her. "He is not walking away from tonight the way he walked away from everything else." If a man burned down an entire criminal network just to walk through one door and find the woman he loved, would you call that romance or would you call that war? Because this story is about to answer that question, and you need to see how it ends. Subscribe now if you haven't already. Lim Taiwook was found in a back office of the warehouse, having apparently attempted to flee through a service exit only to find it already covered by two of Do-Hyun's men. He was not harmed, not in any way that would leave a visible mark, because Do-Hyun had learned long ago that men like Taiwook understood consequences far better than violence, and he intended for this particular consequence to be permanent and unmistakable. "You had her for 4 hours, Do-Hyun said, standing over him in the harsh fluorescent light of the office. Z safely in the car outside with Hune, who had insisted on being present despite her injury, refusing to let anyone else finish what had started on her watch. 4 hours to threaten my wife, to try to break something in me that you assumed was breakable. Let me tell you what actually happened instead." Taiwook, seated in a chair with his hands bound, said nothing, jaw tight, eyes darting between Do-Hyun and the door. "Every account connected to your organization has been frozen as of 90 minutes ago. Every bank that extended you credit has received documentation of your role in corporate espionage, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Evidence that will make it impossible for them to continue any relationship with you without exposing themselves to liability. Every partner you have left will abandon you by morning, not because I asked them to, but because association with you is now a liability no rational businessman will accept." Do-Hyun crouched down until he was eye level with him. "And you are going to spend the rest of tonight explaining to the police, who are already on their way, exactly why my wife was found bound in a warehouse you own. I'm not going to touch you, Taiwook. I don't need to. You did all of this to yourself the moment you decided my wife was a piece you could move on your board. You'll regret leaving me alive," Taiwook said, voice low and venomous. "Men like me don't just disappear." "No," Do-Hyun agreed, standing, straightening his coat. "But men like you do end up in prison for a very long time, with absolutely nothing left to come back to. I find that a far more satisfying ending than anything violence could offer." He turned toward the door. "Enjoy explaining yourself to the authorities. I have a wife to take home." Sirens were already approaching by the time Do-Hyun walked out of the warehouse into the cool night air. Zeri was waiting by the car, wrapped in a blanket someone had produced from somewhere, her face pale but her eyes clear, and the moment she saw him, something in her posture finally, fully relaxed. "Is it over?" she asked as he reached her, pulling her back into his arms without hesitation. "It's over." He pressed his lips to her temple, held her there, breathing her in like he needed to remind himself she was real, whole, safe. "It's over. I promise you, it's over." They didn't speak much on the drive home. Zeri sat pressed against his side, his arm around her the entire way, and when they finally reached the penthouse, she went straight to the shower, needing to wash away the smell of the warehouse, the fear, all of it, and when she came out wrapped in a robe, she found Hune sitting on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. "Hey," she said softly, and he looked up, and the expression on his face nearly broke her heart. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely undone. "I almost lost you," he said quietly. 12 minutes. That's all it took for them to take you from a garage in a building I own, with security I hand-selected, and for 4 hours I did not know if you were safe or hurt or," he stopped, jaw working. "I have spent 14 years building an organization specifically so nothing like this could happen to the people I love, and it happened anyway. I don't know how to reconcile that." Zeri crossed the room, sat beside him, took his hand the way he'd taken hers so many times over the past weeks. "You found me in 4 hours. Hune. 4 hours. Do you understand how impossible that should have been? You didn't fail me tonight. You did the opposite of failing me. It shouldn't have happened at all." "No," she agreed gently. "It shouldn't have. But it did, and instead of falling apart, you tore apart an entire criminal network to get to me. That's not failure. That's the most extraordinary thing anyone has ever done for me in my life." He turned to look at her fully then, and something in his expression shifted, the careful control finally giving way to something rawer, more honest than she'd ever seen from him. "I love you," he said, low and rough. "I have loved you since the night I married you and probably before that, if I'm honest with myself, and tonight I understood exactly how much I stand to lose if I ever let myself believe hiding you was the same as protecting you. I am done hiding anything. I am done being careful with how much of this I let you see. You are my wife, and I want the entire world, my enemies included, to understand exactly what that means." Zeri's eyes filled, and she didn't try to stop it this time. "I love you too. I have for a long time. I just didn't know if it was safe to say it out loud, in a marriage that started so quietly, so carefully." "It's safe now," he said, cupping her face in both hands, the way he had that very first night 18 months ago. "It's safe now, and it always will be, because I am never again going to let carefulness stand in the way of showing you exactly how much you matter to me." He kissed her then, slow and deep and full of everything neither of them had said out loud in 18 months of careful, quiet marriage, and the rest of that night belonged entirely to them, to the relief and the love and the terror finally releasing its grip. Two people who had built a life in secret finally choosing, completely and without reservation, to build the rest of it in the open. The following morning brought a different kind of reckoning. Hune's legal and PR teams worked through the night, and by the time Zhu awoke, the story had already been shaped and released, not as a scandal to be managed but as a truth to be owned. Beck Hune, chairman of Beck Group, released a statement confirming that his wife had been the target of a kidnapping orchestrated by a rival businessman now in police custody, that the couple had chosen to keep their marriage private for security reasons that had, in the end, proven insufficient, and that going forward, they intended to live their lives openly, together, without apology. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Where there had once been whispers about the foreign hire who'd been walked out in handcuffs, there was now a very different narrative. One about a powerful, feared man who had torn apart a criminal network in a single night to save the woman he loved. Zeri's inbox filled with messages from co-workers who had never spoken to her before, some sincere, some clearly opportunistic, and she found she no longer had the energy or the need to sort through which was which. A few days later, Hune's grandmother, a formidable woman named Beck Hune, who had run the family's legitimate businesses for decades before handing them to her grandson, requested a formal dinner. Zari had met her exactly twice in 18 months, brief, carefully managed encounters that had never allowed for anything real to pass between them, and she found herself more nervous walking into that dinner than she had been walking into the warehouse that had nearly claimed her life. "So," Hune said, once the formalities were finished and the tea had been poured, studying Zeri with the same sharp assessing eyes her grandson had inherited. "You are the woman my grandson broke 14 years of careful habit for." "I suppose I am," Zeri said carefully. He kept you hidden for 18 months. Do you know how unusual that is? Hune does not hide things he considers weak or unimportant. He hides things he considers precious enough to be worth protecting at any cost. Yoonhee's expression softened, just slightly, the first real warmth Zuri had seen from her. And then a rival tried to use you against him, and instead of retreating further into secrecy, he tore the entire arrangement into the open. That tells me everything I need to know about what you mean to him. I was terrified he'd blame himself forever for what happened. He will, Yoonhee said simply. Men like my grandson carry things like that for a long time. Your job now is not to convince him it wasn't his fault. It's to make sure he knows that whatever happened, you chose to stay standing beside him anyway. That is worth more than any apology he could offer you. Z thought about that for a long moment, and something in her chest settled, a clarity she hadn't quite had words for until Yoonhee gave them to her. I intend to. Yoonhee smiled then, small and genuine. Good. Then perhaps it is time we started planning a wedding that the entire family can actually attend, instead of 4 witnesses and no photographs. If you want to see a quiet secret marriage become a full, unapologetic love story in front of the whole world, stay with me, because the next part of this story is exactly that. Comment the word wedding if you're ready for it. 3 months passed, and in that time, the life Zuri and Hune built together transformed into something neither of them had quite dared to imagine when they'd married in that small, secretive ceremony over a year earlier. Hune walked her into work every morning without exception now, no longer as a rare, remarkable event but as the simple, steady rhythm of a marriage no longer hidden. Zai earned a promotion, not because of her husband's name but in spite of everyone's assumption that it would be, her work standing on its own merits so thoroughly that even her harshest critics in the finance department had nothing left to whisper about. Lim Tai-wook's trial concluded in late spring, the evidence against him so overwhelming that his lawyers barely mounted a defense. He was sentenced to 18 years for kidnapping, conspiracy, and corporate espionage, and Hune did not attend the sentencing, choosing instead to spend that day exactly where he wanted to be, at home, cooking a meal with Zuri that neither of them were particularly good at making, laughing more than either of them expected to. You didn't want to see him sentenced? Z asked, watching him fumble through a recipe her mother had taught her over a video call, flour dusted across his usually immaculate shirt. I already got everything I needed from him the night I walked into that warehouse and found you alive. He glanced up, something soft and certain in his expression. Watching him get sentenced wouldn't have given me anything more than I already have. This, he gestured at the chaos of their kitchen, the burnt edges of the dish they were attempting, this is worth infinitely more than watching a man I've already defeated sit in a courtroom. The formal wedding took place that summer, in a garden ceremony Yoonhee had insisted on planning down to the last detail, with actual photographs this time, an entire family in attendance, and Zuri's own mother flying in from Lagos for the first time to see her daughter married in a way that finally matched the love the marriage had always contained, even in its secrecy. Hune wore a suit that fit him the way armor once had, except this time there was nothing to defend against, only everything to celebrate. I promise, he said during his vows, voice steady in front of 100 guests in a way it had never needed to be steady before, that I will never again let my instinct to protect you become an instinct to hide you. I promise that whatever comes for us, and something always will, we will face it together, in the open, as exactly what we are. I promise to choose you, loudly and without apology, every single day for the rest of my life. Zuri's vows were shorter, simpler, but no less certain. I spent 3 years making myself small so no one would ask questions about who I really was. I am done being small. I choose you, Baek Hune, in front of everyone who ever doubted either of us, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure the world knows exactly what it means to be your wife. They kissed to applause that neither of them had ever imagined receiving, surrounded by family instead of 4 silent witnesses, and for the first time in their entire marriage, there was nothing left to hide. 8 months after the wedding, on a quiet Tuesday morning that felt entirely unremarkable until it wasn't, Zuri sat on the edge of their bathroom counter staring at a small plastic stick with 2 lines she checked 4 times to be certain she wasn't imagining them. She found Hune in his study, already dressed for work, reviewing a report with the same focused intensity he brought to everything, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment before he looked up and immediately set the report aside, some instinct telling him this required his full attention. "Everything all right?" he asked, already crossing the room toward her. "I need to tell you something," she said, and her voice must have carried something unmistakable, because he stopped in front of her, searching her face with an intensity that made her smile despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "Z." She held up the test, watched the moment it landed, watched 14 years of careful control simply dissolve on his face, replaced by something she had never once seen from him in the entire time she'd known him, pure, unguarded, overwhelming joy. We're, he couldn't finish the sentence, his hands coming up to frame her face, thumbs brushing her cheeks like he needed to touch something real to believe it. "We're having a baby," she confirmed, laughing through tears she hadn't expected. "Hune, we're having a baby." He kissed her then, slow and reverent, and when he pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his voice was thick with something he made no effort to hide. "I built an empire to protect the people I love, and somewhere along the way, without me even noticing it happen, you became the reason any of it mattered at all. And now there's going to be someone new to protect, someone who is going to grow up knowing exactly how loved they are, out in the open, no hiding, no secrets." "No hiding," Zari agreed softly. "No secrets. Just us." Winter arrived, and with it, their daughter, born in the early hours of a snowfall so quiet the whole city seemed to be holding its breath along with them. They named her Aisha, a name that belonged fully to Zeri's heritage the same way Beck belonged fully to his, and when Hune held her for the first time, his hands, steady enough to sign contracts worth billions, to give orders that reshaped entire industries, trembled like they never had before in his life. "Hello," he whispered to his daughter, voice breaking on the single word. "I already love you more than I know how to say, and I promise you, right now, that you will never have to grow up wondering if you belong. You are ours. You are safe. And you will never, ever have to be hidden." Zari watched her husband, the most feared man in Seoul, cry silently over the tiny life in his arms, and thought about the woman she'd been 18 months earlier, walked out of a building in handcuffs for a crime she hadn't committed, terrified to even call her own husband, and the woman she'd become since, a woman who had learned that love, real love, wasn't about making yourself small enough to be safe. It was about finally being seen, completely, by someone who would burn the world down before he ever let you disappear again. "We made it," she said quietly, settling beside him, watching their daughter's tiny fingers curl around Hune's much larger one. "No," he corrected gently, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We're only just beginning." And in the years that followed, that was exactly what it became. Not an ending stitched together from danger and vengeance, but a beginning, loud and unafraid, built by two people who had learned, in the hardest way possible, that the truest kind of protection was never hiding what you loved. It was standing beside it, in the open, and daring anyone who came for it to try. Aisha grew up the way Hune had promised that first snowy night, surrounded, never hidden. She spent her early years toddling through Beck Group's headquarters on Saturday mornings when Hune couldn't fully step away from work, charming security guards who had once been the most feared men in the building, learning to say hello in 3 languages before she turned 2 because Zuri refused to let her daughter grow up thinking Lagos was a place that existed only in stories. Yoonhee doted on her shamelessly, spoiling her with a devotion that surprised everyone who remembered the sharp, assessing woman from that first careful dinner, and more than once Zuri caught her mother-in-law slipping the toddler sweets before dinner with the guilty, delighted expression of a woman who had waited a long time to have someone to spoil. 2 years after Aisha's birth, Zari was offered the position of Senior Director of Finance, the role she'd been quietly working toward since her very first day at Beck Group, back when she'd been nothing but a name on an org chart nobody bothered to learn. She took it without hesitation, and on her first morning in the new role, she found a small package waiting on her desk, wrapped simply, no card. Inside was a pen, elegant and understated, engraved along the barrel with 4 words that made her throat tighten the moment she read them. Yours. Always. No hiding. She kept that pen in the same drawer for the rest of her career, pulling it out on the mornings when the weight of the world felt heaviest, a small, steady reminder of exactly how far they'd come from a parking garage and a box of confiscated belongings. Hune changed too, in ways that surprised even him. The stillness that had once made grown executives brace for disaster the moment he walked into a room began, slowly, to soften into something else entirely, a quiet contentment that people who'd known him for decades struggled to reconcile with the man they remembered. He still ran his empire with the same precision, the same unforgiving standards, but he came home earlier now, missed fewer dinners, learned to cook exactly one dish reasonably well, a spicy Nigerian stew Zoe's mother had taught him over 3 separate video calls, each one ending in laughter at his mistakes and quiet pride at his persistence. "You've gone soft, Chairman," Choi Beam-jun told him once, only half joking, watching Do-hyun leave the office at 6 in the evening for the 3rd day that week, a small, wrapped gift for Aisha's upcoming birthday tucked under his arm. "I've gone exactly where I was always supposed to be," Do-hyun replied, not breaking stride. "I simply took the long way getting here." When Aisha turned 4, they had a second child, a son they named Junho, and the family that had begun in secrecy and near tragedy became, slowly and completely, something loud and unmistakable, for people wrapped around each other in a penthouse that had once felt more like a fortress than a home and now felt like nothing but exactly that. Zoe's mother visited twice a year, filling the apartment with the smell of jollof rice and the sound of stories about a daughter who had once been so quiet, so careful, so determined never to be a burden to anyone, transformed now into a woman who took up exactly as much space as she deserved. On the 5th anniversary of the night she was walked out of Beck Group in handcuffs, a date Zoe had once dreaded revisiting even in memory, Do-hyun surprised her with dinner at the same small cafe near Hongdae where he'd found her that terrible afternoon, tea gone cold in front of her, phone turned face down on the table. He'd had the entire cafe closed for the evening, no cameras, no staff beyond a single server who knew exactly when to disappear, and when she walked in and recognized the window seat, the same one, she nearly cried before he'd said a single word. "I wanted to give this place a better memory," he said simply, pulling out her chair. "This is where I found you at your lowest, and I never want that to be the only thing this city remembers about that day. So tonight, we replace it. Tonight, this becomes the place I told you, for the first time, exactly how proud I am of the life you built out of everything that tried to break you." Zuri reached across the table, took his hand, the same gesture he'd offered her that terrible afternoon now returned in full, 5 years and 2 children and an empire reshaped by love instead of fear later. "You already told me that. Every day since. I just needed you to say it here, I think, so this place could finally belong to something good." "Then let it," Do-hyun said, lifting her hand to his lips exactly as he had that first night. "Let it belong to us." Outside, Seoul moved on the way it always had, indifferent to the 2 people sitting quietly by the window, unaware that the empire quietly controlling half its ports was run by a man who had once nearly lost everything in 12 minutes and had spent every day since making absolutely certain it would never happen again. Inside, none of that mattered. There was only the tea going warm this time instead of cold, and a marriage that had finally, completely, stopped hiding. This story reminds us that love built in secret can still grow into something unshakable, that being underestimated is never the same as being unworthy, and that the people who truly love us will burn down every wall, real or built by fear, to make sure we never have to stand alone again. If this story moved you, if you felt Zee's fear in that garage or Do-hyun's fury in that warehouse or the quiet relief of a marriage finally stepping into the light, hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment telling me what part hit you hardest. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that real love shows up every single time, no matter the cost. Thank you for staying until the very end.